Okay. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay, good. It's always a concern of mine. Good to see everyone. Thank you for sitting with us through this panel. I'm very honored and privileged to have up with me David Mann, who I serve on the board of the American Association of People with Disabilities. David is an economist and does a lot of research in the space of disability and the workplace. I'm going to let him introduce himself. We also have Maria Town, and Maria is the president and CEO of the American Association of People with Disabilities. To say that Maria is amazing would be an understatement. I have never met anyone with the passion and the knowledge. I mean, if there is an issue in the disability community, Maria is all over it and handled it last week. So I will let Maria introduce herself as well. And then Bree Summers, who I have the pleasure of working with regularly as a trial attorney, also is one of my mentees and someone that's just doing amazing work at the firm, and it's been a real privilege to work with her. So before we get into it, David, just could you introduce yourself a little bit more and explain your connection to disability?
Sure. Hello, everyone. My name is David Mann. I'm a principal researcher at Mathematica, where I focus on programs that provide employment or income supports to people with disabilities, specifically transition-age youth with disabilities and working-age adults. I have lived with a disability myself for the past 25 years after experiencing a spinal cord injury as a result of a diving accident. I am actually local. I grew up in Bucks County, which is, and currently live in Bucks County, which is, I understand that your firm's Philadelphia based, or that's where at least the headquarters is, so I'm a local guy.
We don't say headquarters, right, Matt?
Okay. Well, so I'm a local guy, for lack of a better term, and I live in Bucks County with my wife and my son.
And Maria?
Hello, everyone. Again, Maria Town here. As Michael mentioned, President and CEO at the American Association of People with Disabilities, where I have the privilege of working with Michael and David, who are two of our incredible board members. AAPD is a national civil rights organization that seeks to build the political and economic power of the more than 61 million disabled people across the United States. Now, importantly, AAPD is disability-led. So I have cerebral palsy. I've been disabled my whole life. So I have a mobility disability. I also identify as neurodiverse, and all of our staff are also people with disabilities, and we all have different types of disabilities. So we're having to think really creatively about accessibility and inclusion every day. I came to AAPD after working in government for about a decade. I served as the director of the Mayor's Office for People with Disabilities for the city of Houston, and also worked in the Obama administration White House Office of Public Engagement and at the US Department of Labor. Just so you all know, I'm an anthropology major, and I think a lot of people thought that I would be living in a cardboard box, but that did not happen. And I'm originally from Louisiana, and happy to meet some folks with Louisiana connections here. In my personal life, I live in DC with my wife and 2 cats, so if you're a cat person, let me know.
And Bree, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Bree Summers. I think I know almost everybody here. Joe did make me introduce myself several times over the last few years at these. I'm a 5th-year associate in our Philadelphia office. I work mostly in banking and auto finance. I work a lot with Mike. I recently became the chair of the Philadelphia Inclusion Committee. I'm on the hiring committee. I'm a summer program coordinator, and I'm also a member of both the Disability ERG and the Black Attorney ERG. I'm up here because I was diagnosed in the last year with ADHD, and so Mike asked me to share a little bit about my journey and what it was like to be diagnosed after practicing for 4 years and after being over 30 years old. So hopefully I can help. help others who've been late diagnosed too.
Thank you, Bree, and thanks everyone. So the focus of our panel is really about accessibility. And I just want to table set a little bit, because when we think about accessibility, oftentimes we go directly to technology or accommodations. And that's certainly a part of it, but accessibility is a much bigger concept than that. And I want to ask the panel to talk a little bit more about holistically what accessibility looks like. And one of the things, so when I was preparing for this, I had heard many times over about the employment numbers and the high unemployment for people with disabilities. But in preparing for this, I went to, at David's suggestion, the stats compiled by the University of New Hampshire. And it turns out that only 1 in 3 individuals with disabilities are employed, compared to 76% of non-disabled people. Now, I'm not a mathematician, David, but that feels like a statistically significant number. That can't be the whole story, right? I mean, it can't be that there's just not enough workforce out there. But could you talk about that, please?
Sure. Well, those numbers are correct. And there is a profound difference in employment and labor participation rates. So labor participation is people who are either employed or looking for a job. There's a large gap, and there's been a persistent gap for decades between people with and without disabilities as it pertains to employment. And the implications of this are profound for individuals and for our country. Just to give you an example, looking through the lens of a program called Social Security Disability Insurance, or SSDI, which some of you may have heard of. That program provides income support to people with disabilities who are unable to engage in substantive work due to a condition that is going to last at least 12 months or end in death. Most of you, probably all of you in this room, are invested in SSDI through the FICA taxes that you pay. That program provides benefits currently to 8.7 million individuals. The program pays out cash supports of $11.7 billion each month. And those people are also eligible for Medicare benefits about 24 months after they start receiving the cash benefit. So it's a large expense. But if you go even down to the individual level and look at the perspective of someone receiving those benefits, the average monthly benefit is a little over $1,300 a month, which is very difficult to live on in the vast majority of situations. And so these people who are on these programs, they're receiving a cash benefit that's really hard to live on. There are work supports for people who want to test their ability to work, but they're complex and not well understood. And some of my colleagues have actually characterized programs like SSDI and SSI as poverty traps, because once you get into them, they're very hard to get out of because you're potentially risking a benefit, but it's a meager benefit and very difficult to live on.
And Maria, I know that you have done a lot of advocacy in this space. Could you maybe piggyback a little bit on David's answer there?
Sure. So I like to look at the employment numbers as a kind of culmination of the many barriers and stigmas that people with disabilities face in education, in transportation, and in housing, as well as in navigating all of these income support programs. So a lot of times, in order to get a job, you have to have a degree. Well, when you look at the rates of advanced, like professional education, college completion, and high school graduation, all of those numbers are lower for people with disabilities when compared to non-disabled people. We have made progress, right? The numbers of kids with disabilities who are being educated in mainstream classrooms and graduating from high school is much higher than it was even 10 years ago. But when you look across education, particularly, again, colleges and universities, law programs, the numbers become minuscule. So let's say you are a person with a disability who's been able to graduate from high school. Well, one of the things that shifts very differently when you transition from high school to college education is you shift from being covered under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, in which you are entitled to accommodations, to being covered by the Americans with Disabilities Act and Section 504 of the Rehab Act, where you have to request accommodations. So you've shifted systems, and all of a sudden you have to know a lot about yourself to say, here is my disability, and here is what I need to be successful. At AAPD, we work with so many youth with disabilities who don't know how to talk about themselves, who don't have the self-awareness to say, I have ADHD, I need these accommodations. And that's in part because of the enormous stigma that we place on disability at every moment in our lives. So the majority of people with disabilities in the United States are actually folks who have become disabled later in life or who have aged into disability. The majority of people with disabilities don't actually identify as disabled themselves. But when you've set up a system in order to get accommodations where you have to self-disclose, well, that's pretty impossible. And then digging into things like transportation, I grew up in Louisiana, as I mentioned. The town that my family lives in now is a pretty small town, and as of 5 years ago, they have a bus that will take you to Walmart. This is amazing. I don't drive. And so I knew growing up that I would have two choices. I could stay in the community that I loved with the family that had raised me, or I could leave and go live in a place like Washington, D.C., where they had significant investments in public transportation, and I could lead a life that I wanted. Nobody should be faced with that choice. And I'm a lucky one, right? I'm someone whose systems really worked for. I was on SSI, I was a transition age youth that David probably studied, and I got off it, but too few people have that chance.
And thank you, Maria, for that. There's a lot in that answer, and I just want to talk about two components of it. So you mentioned, mainstreaming, and for those in the audience that may not be familiar with it, historically, education for people with disabilities has not happened in the classroom with their peers. Oftentimes they were segregated for a variety of different reasons. When I was diagnosed at age 2 with my hearing problem, my parents were, at the time they had never had an experience with that, and they were told by the people in the process that I probably would not thrive or do well in a mainstream setting, and that I shouldn't be given that opportunity. My parents felt differently, and because of that I was able to go through a program at a school out in Delaware County where they had support for people with hearing problems, and it enabled me really to start on that path to success that Maria described. My life could have gone a very different way with one choice. And so one of the things that becomes very important is this conversation early on about who you are and how you understand that. And Bree, I know that you very recently have been diagnosed with your disability, and I'd like for you to maybe talk about that experience and how that has sort of shaped how you think back about your earlier years.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. I always say that my diagnosis was the biggest blessing and the most heartbreaking one as well. I say that because I grew up with a brother who was what we would call the hyperactive type of ADHD. So he's what you would picture when you think of ADHD, not be able to sit still, fidgeting, super disorganized. And I was always the kid that got straight A's, was a people pleaser. And if I was looking out the window or if I wasn't paying attention, it was because I was too intelligent and I was bored. And that was fine because I was able to get through elementary school, middle school, high school, college, even law school, kind of just zoning out and procrastinating and doing things last minute, and it was no big deal. But when I got to the firm, that all changed because, as everybody here knows, in law school you have 5 exams, and then that's it, and then you get to reset. But that doesn't happen in practice. You have like 20 things and it just never ends. And so, people with ADHD, a lot of times, they have time blindness. They think that they can do things in 20 minutes when it takes 2 hours, or, they procrastinate on things that they don't really like to do, but they can hyper-focus on other things. And so, as I'm sure you guys could understand, it really was a difficult first 4 years. And I was always diagnosed with anxiety, and I thought, maybe I have anxiety, maybe that's why I couldn't do it. But I talked to others with anxiety, and it just wasn't making sense why I would stare at a blank screen or I wasn't able to do certain things. And so providentially last year, my mom went to the Almond Clinic, got a brain scan just to see, what just things that she was dealing with, and she found out that she had ADHD. And when she said that, I was like, there's absolutely no way that you have that. That doesn't make sense, because my own daughter at 5 also had ADHD. She was also hyperactive, and so it didn't make any sense to me. So I started Googling and saw like everything that I had dealt with since I was like 5 all started to make sense, because I was inattentive type. I wasn't hyperactive type. So I look back and it's like I was misdiagnosed with anxiety. I had a lot of coping and survival mechanisms that I did just to keep myself on track. But a lot of that stuff I learned just to survive and wasn't very efficient and wasn't really helpful. And so now I have to go back and unlearn all of that stuff. And I say that this was my biggest blessing, because for a while I just thought, I can't hack it as a lawyer. Like, how did I get here? And of course, everybody's like, you have imposter syndrome, you'll be fine. But staring at a computer screen, not able to do anything for hours, like, it didn't feel like it was going to be fine. So having the diagnosis, being able to get medicine, being able to do coaching sessions, being able to be in support groups where it's like, no, we're all the same. Like, we all have similarities here. You're not crazy, has been so helpful. But I just think back to, if this all started when I was 5, if I got the tools, I probably would be so much further along now. I would be able to cope with it now. So it's hard to look back and realize it was missed, but I guess I'm grateful too, because they say 75% of people with ADHD haven't even been diagnosed, because years ago it was little boys that were getting diagnosed, and now a lot of women are finding out that they have it, and they only found out through a family member, or even sometimes after their career, they leave the career. And so I'm glad that that hasn't happened to me. But I think, early intervention, to the extent it can happen, is best for everybody.
Well, thank you, Bree, for sharing. And I know we had some conversations when you were going through that process, and I'm so thrilled to hear that you've been able to take that diagnosis and really thrive. Which is so related to that is, when it comes to disability issues, it impacts the individual for sure, but it also impacts those around you, whether it's family, friends, caregivers, and that is something that's somewhat unique to this demographic. And I just would like the panelists to sort of talk about that dynamic, the support network that exists or doesn't exist, your personal experience with having a strong support network and the impact that has had on your lives. And again, this is both personal and big picture. So, David.
Sure, yeah. So kind of shifting and talking about my personal experience, I experienced my spinal cord injury, and my parents were getting a divorce at the time, and really was in a single mom household. And so my mom was dealing with a divorce, and then she's also dealing with a child who just had a sudden onset of pretty significant disability. And to her credit, she was able to, with the help of others around her and our extended family, just provide me with care and support that I needed to kind of reset and reorient my life. Rehabbed at Jefferson, and then McGee, which again, both places just around the corner from here. And one thing that stands out actually is, as much as supportive as my extended family was, my grandparents had a very narrow view of what a person with a disability could do, and really wanted to. I think they thought it was protecting, but in retrospect, if I had gone down that path, I really wouldn't have been able to live the life that I wanted to live. Kind of reminds me of that comment you had a few moments ago. And but no, my mom said, no, David's going to go out, he's going to have the same opportunities as other people. If he wants to go to college, that's what he's going to do. If he wants to go to grad school, that's what he's going to want. You know, we're going to do our best to make that happen. And I think my story would be very different if I didn't have people like that in my life, especially my mother during that time, the first initial years of my injury.
Maria?
Sure. So to take things sort of from the personal experience to a kind of systems comment, many people with disabilities need or rely on some kind of support, whether that is personal attendant care or job coaching or community-based mental health supports. And this system is incredibly strained. So in Texas, when I lived there, the wait list for a Medicaid waiver to receive personal attendant services was 10 years long. Many people died, right, waiting to get the benefits that they needed to survive. And this issue of direct support professionals is one that is really a crisis at this point. On both the kind of individual consumer side and on the workforce side. So the workforce of direct support professionals are primarily women of color. Many of these women are disabled themselves from performing this very intense labor. And the average wage across the nation is $12 an hour. Many of these jobs do not come with any kind of benefits or job security, and so the turnover rate is incredibly high. In the disability community, one of the things that we value most is something called interdependence. Now I realize that, you know, I'm in Philadelphia, y'all are really into independence, and I want you to consider something called interdependence, and that is the recognition that we all rely on one another to survive, to get through our days, and to thrive. So even if you are someone who can wake up, get yourself ready, eat breakfast, go to work, do your job, come back home, you're still relying on the people who have designed the streets, made sure the traffic signals work, who have produced your food, who have helped keep your house clean, right? Well, in the disability community, we feel that almost every day. So even for me, sometimes my friends who maybe have muscular dystrophy or spinal cord injuries themselves, if their direct support worker, if their child is sick and can't show up, I'm the one that's trying to figure out how to work the Hoyer lift to make sure they can get to bed, or helping them with food. As a disabled person, I've had to be a kind of natural organizer in order to get my needs met, because I need a huge system of support to make my life possible. But one of the things that really helped me come to terms with that and not feel bad about asking for help is actually realizing that everyone needs help. Just not everybody has to ask in the same way I do.
And Bree, you talked about your personal experience of late, sort of going through some coaching. Could you talk a little bit more about how that experience has helped you sort of adapt and thrive and, you know, sort of achieve within your experience?
Yeah, I think, I'll go back. My dad was really into mental health growing up, so I've been through therapy a lot, and with my anxiety, I went through therapy with that. And I tried that with the ADHD and just realized it wasn't really as good a fit as maybe coaching would be, so I tried that. I started about, I guess, like 3 months ago. Actually, Margot, who's on the board, set me up with ADHD coaching and then group sessions, and I think the group sessions especially felt the most helpful, just because everybody who has ADHD presents differently, and I think it was so helpful to have a community who's like, you know, I went through this last year too, or 2 years ago, and yeah, I have the same problem with doing timesheets or with keeping papers organized or whatever the case may be. But then the coaching has been really helpful because it just gives you the tools needed. You know, once I got the tools that I needed to be able to implement to do my work, I was able to do it so much more easily. And that's why I say it was kind of heartbreaking, because I struggled for so many years trying to fit in with everybody else and do the work that my colleagues were doing. And I just didn't realize, it's not because I can't do it, it's just because I needed some additional tools, and then it all started to click. So even though I've only been going through it for about 3 months, it's been life-changing. What years of therapy couldn't do, it's done it in 3 months, so.
Yeah, and so one of the issues, that comes up is how we're talking about a lack of disabled representation in the workforce. And what do we do about that? How do we increase participation? And in the disabled community, there's this idea of self-identification, which candidly, it's something I had never put a lot of thought into. It was probably about 8 or 9 years ago when one of our colleagues, Lauren DeBrucker, approached me and asked if I would self-identify as disabled. And at the time, I said, of course. I didn't think about it. And then in the past couple of years, getting more involved with AAPD and particularly conversations around how that can be the first step to empowerment, self-identification. But it can be fraught with peril, because this is a very vulnerable thing. So, Maria, could you maybe talk a little bit about the complexity of the self-identification issue?
Absolutely. So self-disclosure, self-identification is an extremely personal choice and decision. For people like me, the moment I move through a room, I'm disabled, at least in one way. You may not know the other types of disabilities that I manage that are non-apparent, and that's important. A lot of people will say invisible disabilities, but Bree, to your story, I don't like using the word invisible, because invisibility isn't real, right? And it sets up this automatic expectation that these disabilities are somehow fake. I like non-apparent, because once you learn to kind of observe people, you can see the girl who is able to procrastinate until 1 minute before the deadline and knock out all the work, but can't focus beforehand, right? You can see the boy who is having to leave his, schedule shorter meetings because he needs to use the bathroom more frequently. That's what I mean by non-apparent. Anyway, because of the stigma against disability, oftentimes it's not safe to disclose, and particularly for psychiatric disabilities, which may be even more stigmatized, conditions like bipolar disorder, where people have this instant assumption that you're not able to manage your emotions. It can be very scary, and especially if you're in a workplace that has not discussed disability in a positive way, where you don't know how a manager or how an HR professional is going to respond when you disclose not only your disability, but potentially your accommodation needs. The last thing you want to hear is, I don't think you can do this job anymore, right? I don't think you're the right fit here anymore. Now, is somebody really going to say that to you? I hope not. But they might do so in other subtle ways, which I know as lawyers you all appreciate the difference between overt discrimination and intentional discrimination and unintentional discrimination. But it can be extremely painful, and it can actually cause even more harm and actually cause disabilities and other health conditions to become worse. And so for a lot of times what we see is that folks don't disclose, their performance is impacted because they don't have the accommodations they need, and ultimately they're fired, or they're not allowed to advance. And that contributes to the employment numbers that Michael was mentioning earlier and why they're so low.
And David, when we were preparing for this panel, we talked about this issue, and you had talked about that sensation of when you come into a room, you feel the eyes on you because your disability is apparent. So from the other side of the spectrum, can you talk about how a workplace can do a better job of making someone feel more integrated and part of the fabric of the office?
Sure. I think it's important to try and build a culture of inclusion when it comes to disability and other forms of diversity as well. Just reflecting on my experience at my own firm, Mathematica, I think that we've tried and build a culture that, especially the group of us that does work related to disability, that we see the perspectives that are brought through disability as an asset, as something of value. And when something's considered valuable, it's something you want to talk about, it's something you want to engage with. Saying that the experiences that I've had and the things that I've gone through can add value to the work that I do really makes me feel comfortable and willing to open up and to talk about my disability and my experiences openly, and to ask for a workplace accommodation if I need it, which again removes barriers from me so that I can do my work more effectively.
And Bree, you obviously have just lived through this process. Be interested to hear what helped you sort of come to terms with and get comfortable with making that disclosure, seeking accommodation.
Well, there was this partner named Mike Zula who asked if I would share with the whole room whether or not
That was not planned. That question was not planned.
No, you did help me a lot though, Mike, because I think what Maria was saying is true. Usually you don't know that somebody has a disability until work performance is affected or they feel like they need to disclose, because, and like what you said, it's not that it's invisible, but nobody knows it until, you see maybe some social interactions that are a little bit more awkward, or procrastination, or struggling with finishing timesheets and things like that. But I hid it pretty well for 4 years. I don't know, I didn't tell anybody else in this room before today, so I don't know that anybody thought that I had it. But I think that's one of the reasons, right, that I wanted to be up here, because I think that transparency is so key, and not saying that everybody should disclose, because it is very personal. And if you told partners, like there's this associate who she really is earnest and she wants to do well, but she's gonna get stuff done at 12:30 and turn it in, or she's gonna struggle with billing, or she's gonna work odd hours, or she's gonna go out with clients and she'll be totally quiet because she's so afraid of verbal vomiting. I don't know what partner here is gonna be like, yes, please have her sign up to be on my team. But, and so I think that's it's hard. I wouldn't tell anybody who doesn't feel comfortable, and especially now that I'm more senior, I feel a lot more comfortable. My team, and especially you, have been, just key in making me feel comfortable, and not oh, I'll be fired if something goes wrong. But you really encourage me to be verbal, because you want to get out ahead of these things coming out. If I'm struggling with something, I'd rather talk it through with you and let you know than hide. But I did for a few years just hide and was hoping nobody would see me. And as you get more senior and if you want to progress in the firm, you can't do that for very long, as I found out. So I think that's the biggest thing. But I think second, for the people who do feel like they want to mentor and want to reach other people and even find a community within Duane, it's so important to disclose when you feel ready. And I'm hoping by doing that maybe that'll open up other people to be able to do it as well.
I'm going to put a plug in. If you haven't worked with Bree, you should. She's phenomenal.
Now that nobody wants to work with me.
I just want everyone to understand that if you need a hardworking, dedicated associate, Bree Summers in Philadelphia. We at the firm, Joe has been very supportive of the disability issues, of all of the diversity, equity, and inclusion issues. And we have an ERG group for people with disabilities and neurodiversity, which I'm fortunate enough to be one of the co-leaders of. And that has been, for me, a wonderful experience, because it's created a place for people to talk openly and honestly about these issues. And we've helped people get accommodations. We've helped people navigate these tricky issues of self-disclosure collectively. It's not me, it's a group. David, what are some other examples of good workplace practices that you can think of to sort of help foster that feeling of empowerment and inclusion?
I'll give you a few examples. I think one that that I've seen at my own company that I think has been really valuable is the ERG has kind of taken upon itself to try and educate, I think, other parts of the company in best practices related to disability. And I think that that's actually been a really valuable exercise. For example, providing slides before meetings, making sure things are in accessible format so all of our colleagues can access them, incorporating those, educating leadership and other staff about those best practices so that we can all access and learn together. I think that it's also important to build clear and transparent processes for things like requesting accommodations. When I first got to my company, it was not clear, and they were more than willing to accommodate, but the pathway on how that was done was unclear, and that could cause problems, and that may cause some people to not ask for an accommodation because they don't know who to go to, or they don't feel comfortable because they don't understand the process. So those are a couple examples, I think, of things that companies can do to promote disability inclusion.
Thank you. And Maria, same question for you.
I want to acknowledge, I actually think Duane Morris is ahead of the curve in a lot of ways. And one way is actually that your ERG has the word disability in it. Again, tied to the stigma around disability, a lot of times we use euphemisms. And at big companies, you see ERGs called unique abilities or all abilities or special needs. And my needs aren't special, they're human, right? Can you imagine if I went up to my board members as my bosses and said, Michael and David, I have some unique needs. And they would say, well, we have unique needs too, Maria. What are you talking about, right? So I think when we use those euphemisms, we actually erase disability. We distance ourselves from it. And so it's really great that y'all's is people with disabilities and neurodiversity. I also think building a culture of inclusion, like David said, is so important because it actually reduces the overall administrative burden on your employees with disabilities and on your managers who are having to navigate the accommodations process. So for your virtual meetings, having your automated captions on all the time, not requiring people to request that they be turned on. Similarly, for all of your events, actually having a prompt to ask about accommodations. Doing events like this where you feature speakers with disabilities who can talk about how it is an identity and a community. And finally, looking at the vendors you work with and the systems that you use for things like billing, time and attendance, and document management. A lot of these systems are incredibly inaccessible. And there are not great standards for the accessibility of things like websites or apps. So, is your website Web Content Accessibility Guidelines 2.0 AA compliant? Do you know the answer to that question?
I think it's yes.
I hope it's yes, right?
Yes, because we just did the DEI survey.
Yeah.
And it's on the website. It's under the accessibility tab on our website. It says very specifically that I think it's WCAG 2.0 and maybe 3.0, but.
We're not at 3.0 doesn't exist yet, so.
Okay, well, it's, I'm optimistic. I'm optimistic.
But everyone should know that. So nobody has any doubts. And so, just a lot of suggestions.
Well, one thing that we found was that some of our external websites were compliant, but some of the applications that we used internally were not.
Right.
And then we had staff hired with certain types of disabilities, and they weren't able to use certain platforms. So it's important to evaluate all the applications that you're using and all the websites, whether it's on the internet or your intranet. And
Bree, speaking about it from the perspective of someone who's just had to navigate a lot of these waters, what programs helped you the most? What internally was something that empowered you?
Yeah, so funny enough, before I was even diagnosed, I sat down with Ryan Borneman, who's also on our team, and as I got more senior, you get more and more cases and hundreds of emails a day, and it was all hard to keep up with. And so Ryan was like, well, what is your system? How are you keeping track of it? I'm like, well, this notepad. But sometimes the notepad doesn't make it home with me. Sometimes it's here. Sometimes it's in a stack of notepads. So he showed me just using Microsoft Office in the flag system, which I really, I've seen it used, but the way he uses it is, putting the deadline in the header, opening up the actual flag and putting everything about the case in there, and then having that accessible with internal deadlines that are way ahead of what other internal deadlines for partners or for clients would be. And that really helped me, because the thing about people who have ADHD, it's really hard to stay organized, and all of us have the notepads everywhere or things everywhere, and as long as it's in front of us, we can find it, but you put it down and it gets lost. And so that was been very helpful. And just the deadlines and breaking up in smaller chunks, because it gets easy to be overwhelmed, especially as a junior associate anyway, but with ADHD, it's that much harder. So I think doing things like that, there's also certain to-do list apps and things that have been really, really helpful for me. Other apps that block out distractions, because there's a lot of distractions. But I think the pandemic actually really helped me, because having the flexibility to go home and come into work, there are days that I need to be in work because I need to get out of my house and I need to just see other people. And then there are other days where it's okay, I need to just hunker down in my office. And if people are chatting or if people are knocking on the door constantly, I'm not going to be able to finish the assignment, because I have to have 5 hours to just hyperfixate and focus on this assignment. And so having that flexibility and not a set schedule was actually probably the most helpful thing since the pandemic has started.
So we're coming up towards the end here, and I want to ask each of you a question as we're looking forward and thinking about, progress and how we move forward. What is one thing that you would want people in this room to understand about, where do we go from here? What's the next evolution of this process?
Yeah. For me, I think my hope would be that people start to see and understand the value of employing people with disabilities, that there's value added here. You can make legal arguments for hiring people with disabilities. You can make moral arguments for hiring people with disabilities, but I also think you can make a business argument for hiring people with disabilities. I mean, I look at your two colleagues here, and they're exceptional individuals who bring a lot of value to the work that you do. Why would you not want to hire them because of their disabilities, right? So I think it's important to recognize that people with disabilities bring value to the workplace, as well as all the other settings that they're in. We want to accommodate them throughout their lifetime so that they can live the lives they want, and also just acquire the skills and experience that allows them to contribute in the ways they'd like to. And then I think that firms like yours should be proactive in recruiting and hiring people with disabilities, because it will make what you do just that much better.
So to focus on the legal field, I really want to see a few things. I want to see students who are sitting for the LSAT not have to go to battle to get the accommodations they need, because even though that has been in regulation for I think about 6 years, it's still really hard. I want to see people be able to disclose their disabilities, and particularly their psychiatric disabilities, to the bar, and not worry about whether or not they will be accepted. And there's a disability bar exists, but it is comprised of attorneys who work on disability issues like benefits claims. It's not comprised of disabled attorneys. And I want to see that change. I want to see a national space for disabled attorneys, and there's a very nascent one right now, but it is brand new. And ultimately, I want folks to know that when they are diagnosed with a disability, or when they're realizing they have a disability, that their life is not over, and that especially for issues like addiction, that people can be open with their managers and employee assistance programs to get the support that they need to thrive.
I think I'd like to see a couple things too. One, education around the topic, maybe even implicit bias training around it. I think, again, the stigma is like the biggest reason people don't disclose or don't get the help they need. They try to either numb it or shut it out, pretend it's not there. And then for partners and others who, you might see this associate who's struggling, instead of thinking, oh, they're lazy, oh, they're not cut out for this, oh, they're doing all these other things when they could be doing work. Sit down with them. Like Mike had a conversation with me, like, listen, like what's going on? It seems like you're struggling. And then I was able to open up to him because I had been recently diagnosed. But if he never did that and he just wrote it up or put it in my file, I probably wouldn't be here, to be honest with you. So I think we need more people who will be allies. And instead of, if somebody's coming to you and saying like, this is what I have, instead of saying, oh, like you need to prove it, or oh, everybody's a little ADHD or whatever, making light of it, listen to them and say, thank you for telling me that. What can I do to help? And sometimes we don't know what you can do to help. Sometimes we just need that listening ear and to be like, you're not going to get fired. We'll figure a way to like work this out. But sometimes we do know, and you can actually be a help with that. And I would say lastly, like for the people that have it and are okay with disclosing, opening up so that people can come to you, because again, it's not something that you can see with at least people who are not neurotypical. And so, while you might have a guidepost, like I'm a minority, an ethnic and racial minority, so I can kind of figure out who to go to. But as far as, people who are neurodivergent or have ADHD, I have no clue. And so to the extent I can be that for people, I'm happy to. And for the people who feel comfortable, I think raising your hand and we need to support the people who are raising their hand. Don't let them, think that they're going to be fired or treated differently. So those are my takeaways.
Well, thank you very much, everyone. And this has been great. And thank you all for listening.